Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to do a little bit of practice with related to monopoly. And this actually is the second practice set. So hopefully you've taken a look at both natural monopolies and a little bit about inefficiencies with monopolies before you try this practice. The first part says use these letters, just the same idea as the last time we did practice, but there's different questions here. The elastic range of demand. Well, this is going to be the range where marginal revenue is greater than zero. And so I'm going to look at the demand curve and I'm going to look at the marginal revenue and go, okay, all the way up the demand curve to point B, all the way up to P1, that's the range of the demand curve where marginal revenue is greater than zero, right? Where that curve is above the x-axis. So we would say P1 to point B, that's the range. It goes all along the demand curve. Point B is actually the unit elastic point, and then past that point's the inelastic range. Deadweight loss is going to be the points from point A to F to C. And C is our optimal, right? C is our socially optimal point. And so we would say A, C, F. And again, that's in that same spot if we took a look back on the previous video to see where that deadweight loss would be with an artificial monopoly. Socially optimal quantity is going to occur where price equals marginal cost, or where demand equals marginal cost. So I'm going to look at my demand curve and my marginal cost curve. Optimal point, we already marked it here actually in order to find this deadweight loss. That's going to occur at Q3. So I'm looking on the x-axis to find the quantities, Q3. And now the socially optimal consumer surplus. If they were at socially optimal, how much would the consumer surplus be? And that goes from the price that they would be charging all the way up to the demand curve. So if we were producing Q3 units, the socially optimal quantity, I go up to the demand curve to point C, and I find that the price would be right here at P4. So the amount of consumer surplus would be all the way from here, right, over to point C, is kind of that point, all the way up there. So it'd be a fairly large little triangle, a fairly large triangle of P1 to P4 all the way over to C. Again, going from the price that we are paying all the way up to the demand curve. Now, quantity with zero economic profit, that's going to be where price equals ATC. Where are they breaking even? And I'm going to look on the demand curve and find ATC. Here that occurs at point D, and the quantity there is Q4. Okay, next we're going to take a little practice on drawing a couple of market structures and labeling producer and consumer surplus. So for the first one, we have a perfectly competitive market, and that's going to be just our old friend supply and demand. Now, some students, when they see this, might want to draw their Mr. DARP and their average cost curve. This is a market, not a firm. So we have an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity in the market, price and quantity. And then the area above that price is the consumer surplus, and the area below that price is the producer surplus. But what we're going to look at here is what would a monopoly look like. Now, it doesn't tell us what type of monopoly, so I'm going to draw an artificial monopoly. But you're welcome to draw a natural monopoly. You could still do it. The first step, remember, is that we always put our demand and marginal revenue. Then we're going to draw a marginal cost curve. Now, the marginal cost curve is basically our stand-in for our supply curve. And if you kind of use your mind's eye at this point, you could even see that, like, if they were competitive, they would be right there, right? That would be the competitive price. That would be the competitive quantity. You could even kind of visualize that that consumer surplus would be there, and then the producer surplus would be here. But this firm doesn't price here, and they don't have that quantity there. Instead, their quantity is determined by MR equals MC. So the quantity the firm produces is actually going to be less, right? Kind of thinking using our mind's eye. And by the way, the point where marginal revenue crosses here does not have to line up with that. It just happens to based on how I drew it. And I go all the way up here, and I find the price. And so now I can see that actually the firm in this monopoly market is going to charge a much higher price than actually what the competitive market would do. If I'm going to start with shading and labeling producer and consumer surplus, well, I know the area above the price, up the demand curve, all of that up here is the consumer surplus. The area down below that price, all the way down actually to the marginal cost curve, and up that quantity side is the producer surplus. So it may appear like the producers have about the same. Realistically, it kind of depends on the size of the market, whether they would or they wouldn't. But in general, what we would say is that because they're kind of capturing all this stuff up here in terms of the surplus from up here that used to be part of the surplus of the consumers, then we would say the producers are typically better off in a monopoly. That wouldn't be surprising, right? They're charging a higher price. They're usually earning economic profit. Now, the last thing it says is that we want to shade and label the deadweight loss. And so deadweight loss here is the value of the transactions that are not happening, that typically would happen in a competitive market. These are the lost surplus that we would have had. So if you kind of use your mind's eye, it would be like that little tip of the surplus just gets poof, disappeared, gone forever. We never get it back. So we're kind of analyzing and comparing here the efficiency of these relative markets. We would say that this is the optimal point, right? This is where price equals the kind of where supply and demand equal each other, where price equals marginal cost. But we also would say that here is the optimal point, and we can see that we are not producing at that socially optimal point. We are allocatively inefficient. We have deadweight loss. If deadweight loss occurs, what's it tell you about allocative efficiency? Well, it's not. It's not efficient. So the fact of it existing will tell us that it is not efficient. What's true about marginal revenue that causes that? Well, marginal revenue is down here. If marginal revenue were up here, then actually we wouldn't have this problem. So marginal revenue is less than demand is why this problem happens. If the marginal revenue curve were up here, then we would produce where MR equals MC, and we would actually be at that optimal level. Consumer surplus is smaller in a monopoly. We can literally see it's smaller, and that occurs. Why? Well, the price is higher, and we would say, and the quantity is smaller, right? That's why that triangle gets a little bit smaller, is that basically we're losing the bottom part of it. Some of it's getting turned into deadweight loss, some of it's getting turned into producer surplus, and that's occurring because the price was up and the quantity was smaller than what it would be in an optimal market. And the last part, what else have we learned that leads to deadweight loss? We've actually learned 5 different things that cause deadweight loss, and it occurs in general because we're not at the optimal, socially optimal quantity, right? We're not at the quantity where price equals marginal cost or where demand equals supply, because those are kind of ways, there's 2 ways of the same thing, price and demand, marginal cost and supply. If we're not producing where supply and demand intercept, and we are not here, right? The marginal cost is kind of our stand-in, we're not producing that, then we are not allocatively efficient, we have deadweight loss. The 5 things we've actually learned in no particular order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. See if you can come up with them all, right? Pause the video for about 5 seconds and think about them. Price ceilings. Price floors. Now we're ringing a bell. Quotas. Yeah, you probably forgot that one. Per unit tax and a per unit subsidy. All 5 of those are government interventions into an efficient market that cause it to have deadweight loss. And that causes the quantity, that is to say their intervention causes the quantity to not be at socially optimal. And that's why the deadweight loss is happening. Now, all of these would lead to a market failure as a result of basically the government intervention. But this is an example of a market failure where the market fails all by itself. And that's a really important observation to make, is that sometimes markets fail even in the absence of any kind of government intervening in that market. All right, so hopefully this practice with efficiency helped you a little bit understanding monopoly. I'll see you next time.